Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a part of history that's often swept under the toga, the utterly grim, no good, very bad reality of Roman child soldiers. Picture this. You're just a kid, maybe 7 or 8, clutching a wooden sword instead of a toy. Your playground a dusty training ground, and your lullabies replaced by the clang of metal and the shouts of centurions. You probably think of the Roman Empire as glorious, a place of mighty legions and grand architecture. But for many children, it was a relentless machine that chewed up innocence and spat out hardened, often broken, warriors. Honestly, if you were born back then, you'd likely not make it past your teenage years, let alone survive the brutal conscription. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's 1:16 p.m. in Hai Dung, Vietnam for me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might imagine childhood in ancient Rome as a simpler time, perhaps filled with games and familial warmth. And for some, particularly those born into wealthy, influential families, there was certainly a degree of sheltered upbringing. You'd have tutors, slaves to attend to your needs, and a future path perhaps laid out for you in politics or trade. But this idyllic vision, like much of history, is often painted with a broad, rose-tinted brush. For the vast majority of Roman children, particularly those in the lower echelons of society, the plebeians, the freedmen, and especially the children of the poor, life was a brutal lottery, and often, the prize was an early introduction to hardship, labor, and for many, the military. Imagine yourself as a young Roman boy, perhaps named Lucius, growing up in a cramped insula, a multi-story apartment block teeming with life, noise, and the constant smell of refuse. Your parents are likely working from dawn till dusk. Your father perhaps a laborer at the docks or a craftsman in a small workshop. Your mother managing the household and whatever meager income she could generate. Playtime isn't structured or supervised. It's snatching moments in the crowded streets, dodging carts and stray dogs, mimicking the adults around you. You're not dreaming of becoming a philosopher or a poet. You're just trying to survive the day. The concept of a distinct, protected childhood, as we understand it today, was largely absent in Roman society. Children were seen as miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household as soon as they were physically able. For boys, this often meant learning a trade alongside their fathers, assisting in the fields, or running errands in the bustling city. Girls were trained in domestic duties, preparing for marriage and motherhood from a surprisingly young age. It was a utilitarian view of youth, where every individual, regardless of size or age, was a potential asset to the family unit and, by extension, to the state. This brings us to a particularly uncomfortable truth: the Roman military, a juggernaut of conquest and control, had a voracious appetite for manpower. While we often envision the legionary as a grizzled veteran in his prime, the reality is that the ranks were frequently swelled by the young, sometimes shockingly so. It wasn't always a formal enlistment process for preteens. Mind you, historians still debate the precise age of formal recruitment, but the lines between civilian life, apprenticeship, and military service often blurred, especially for the sons of soldiers or those from impoverished rural areas. You might not have been officially enlisted at 8, but your life could very well be leading you down that path, whether you knew it or not. Consider the atmosphere of a Roman family where the father or elder brothers were already serving in the legions. The stories they brought home, often glorified but laced with the harsh realities of campaigning, would have been your bedtime tales. You'd hear about the discipline, the marching, the glory, but also the relentless training, the constant threat of injury or death, and the sheer monotony of camp life. You'd play soldiers with your friends, not with plastic toys, but with sticks and stones, mimicking the drills you saw older boys practicing or the legionaries marching through your town. This wasn't just play, It was often an unconscious form of preparation, a cultural indoctrination into the martial ethos that permeated Roman society. For those born into military families, the path was even clearer. The sons of centurions, tribunes, and even ordinary legionaries were often expected to follow in their father's footsteps. They would grow up in military camps, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and routines of army life. They might start by helping with chores, running messages, or assisting the camp cooks. These seemingly innocuous tasks were, in fact, a subtle form of apprenticeship. You'd learn the hierarchy, the jargon, the strict discipline, and the practicalities of camp management long before you ever picked up a gladius in anger. It was an environment designed to acclimatize you, to make the transition from child to potential soldier as seamless as possible. You'd absorb the military culture through osmosis, an often unspoken curriculum of duty, obedience, and the unquestioning loyalty to Rome. An uncommon detail that often gets overlooked is the role of the contubernarium. This was the smallest unit of the Roman legion, typically 8 men who shared a tent and a mess. Often, these groups would include boys who weren't formally enlisted but were attached to the unit. They might be the sons of soldiers, orphans taken in by the legion, or simply very young camp followers. Their duties would be menial but essential: fetching water, gathering firewood, cooking, cleaning armor, caring for pack animals. While they weren't expected to fight in pitched battles, they were certainly present on campaigns, exposed to the same dangers of disease, hunger, and sudden attack as the full-fledged soldiers. Imagine yourself as one of these boys, trudging alongside battle-hardened men, your small frame dwarfed by their armor and equipment, your eyes wide with the raw reality of war. This early exposure wasn't always a choice. For families struggling with poverty, sending a son to the military, even in an unofficial capacity, could be a desperate act of survival. The army offered a semblance of stability, regular, if meager rations, and the faint promise of a better future, or at least a way to escape starvation. You wouldn't have the luxury of intellectual pursuits or idle play. Your time would be consumed by the grim necessity of contributing, of earning your keep, of simply staying alive in a world that offered little comfort or security. The Roman concept of pietas, a profound sense of duty, loyalty, and devotion to family, state, and gods, played a significant role in this early militarization. From a young age, you were taught the importance of serving Rome, of upholding its values, and of contributing to its might. Stories of legendary heroes like Cincinnatus, who left his farm to lead the army and then returned to his plow, were ingrained in your mind. This wasn't just abstract philosophy, it was a practical expectation. Your life, in many ways, was not entirely your own. It belonged, at least in part, to the Republic, and later, the Empire. Even something as mundane as Roman education, for those who received it, often had a martial undertone. While you might learn to read and write, the texts would often be epic poems glorifying war and conquest, tales of brave generals and victorious legions. History lessons would focus on Rome's military triumphs, reinforcing the idea that strength, discipline, and military prowess were the cornerstones of Roman identity. You wouldn't be encouraged to question, you'd be encouraged to emulate. Think about the physical demands placed on children. Even outside of formal military training, life was hard. You walked everywhere, carried heavy loads, and engaged in strenuous physical labor from a young age. This built a certain resilience, a toughness that would serve you well if you ever found yourself marching with a legion. It's a stark contrast to our modern, often sedentary, childhoods. You didn't need a gym, your daily life was a constant workout. While formal conscription generally targeted older teenagers and young men, the prevalence of childlike figures in military camps, and even on the fringes of battlefields, is a point of academic discussion. Some historians argue that these were largely camp followers, or unofficial apprentices, while others contend that the lines were far more blurred. Especially during times of great need or prolonged conflict, it's a thorny issue because explicit records of child soldiers as we define them today are rare. But the circumstantial evidence and the societal norms of the time paint a compelling, if uncomfortable, picture. So, as you drift off, consider the stark reality that for many Roman children, the innocence of youth was a fleeting luxury, quickly replaced by the heavy mantle of responsibility, and for a significant number, the even heavier armor of a burgeoning warrior. Their toys were often training tools, their game simulations of battle, and their future, more often than not, inexorably linked to the relentless rhythm of the Roman military machine. As you continue to drift deeper into the story, picture young Lucius again, no longer just a vague figure but a tangible presence on the dusty training grounds of Rome. The transition from free play to formalized training wasn't a sudden jolt, but a gradual, insidious process. You'd be 5 or 6, maybe, when the first whispers of your potential future began to solidify. For many, it started within the family unit itself. Your father, if he was a soldier, might have begun teaching you the rudimentary holds for a wooden sword, showing you how to stand firm, how to thrust, how to parry. These weren't just games, they were the earliest foundations of a martial education. A subtle, often unspoken preparation for a life that was increasingly leaning towards the legion. You'd see older boys, perhaps those just entering their teens, engaged in more rigorous drills. They'd be running with weighted packs, practicing formations with mock spears, and wrestling in the dirt, their bodies already hardening, their faces etched with determination. This wasn't just observation, it was a form of peer pressure, a societal expectation that you, too, would one day join their ranks. To shirk from such activities would be seen as weakness, a failure to embody the very essence of Roman masculinity and duty. The Roman concept of virtus, often translated as virtue, was deeply intertwined with courage, strength, and military prowess. From an early age, you were implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, taught that to be a true Roman man was to be a warrior, or at least capable of being one. Stories of heroes like Horatius Cocles, who defended the Sublician Bridge alone against an Etruscan army, or the self-sacrificing Decii Muris, who ritually dedicated themselves to death in battle for Rome's victory, permeated the cultural fabric. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were blueprints for how you were expected to live. And if necessary, die. Formalized training for boys who were destined for military life, or who simply came from families that saw it as a path to advancement, often began in earnest around the age of 14, though, as we've discussed. Earlier involvement was far from uncommon. But even before that, your physical development was constantly being honed. You didn't have organized sports leagues like we do today. Instead, your sports were often utilitarian and physically demanding running, jumping, wrestling, swimming in rivers, climbing trees. These activities, while seemingly innocent, built the stamina, strength, and agility that would be absolutely vital on the battlefield. Think about it. You were essentially in a constant, low-grade physical training regimen just by living your daily life. Consider the equipment. A Roman legionary's gear was heavy. The lorica segmentata, the segmented plate armor, was robust but restrictive. The scutum, the large rectangular shield, weighed around 15 to 20 pounds. Then there was the pilum, the heavy javelin, the gladius, the short sword, and a host of tools, cooking equipment, and personal effects, all carried on your back for miles every day. To be able to march for hours, sometimes days, under a scorching sun or through driving rain, then set up camp, and then potentially fight, required immense physical conditioning. This conditioning often started in childhood, long before you ever saw a real battle. The Roman military was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of Roman society's pragmatic and often brutal efficiency. It was a machine that required constant feeding, not just of food and supplies, but of manpower. And when the demand for soldiers was high, particularly during prolonged wars or civil conflicts, the age limits could become astonishingly flexible. While the official minimum age for legionary service was generally set at 17 or 18, exceptions were made, and boys as young as 14 or even younger in dire circumstances found themselves bearing arms. Historians still grapple with the exact numbers and specific instances of this phenomenon, largely due to the patchy nature of ancient records, but archaeological finds, epigraphic evidence inscriptions, and casual references in literary sources suggest it was far from rare. An uncommon detail that hints at this is the discovery of very small legionary rings or miniature armor fragments in some archaeological sites associated with Roman military encampments. While these could belong to children simply living with their soldier parents, they also suggest a level of integration that went beyond mere presence. Were these tokens for child apprentices, or were they worn by boys who, though officially underage, were performing duties that placed them squarely within the military sphere, effectively functioning as child soldiers? It's a chilling question that doesn't have a definitive, easy answer. Imagine being one of these boys, thrust into the grim reality of camp life. You'd be taught not just how to wield a weapon, but how to march in formation, how to dig a ditch for a trench, how to construct a rampart, how to set up a tent, and how to cook your meager rations over an open fire. Discipline was paramount, enforced with a severity that would shock modern sensibilities. Floggings, public humiliations, and even capital punishment for desertion or insubordination were commonplace. You'd learn quickly that obedience wasn't just about following orders. It was about survival. You might be assigned as a colons or milites caligati, terms that could refer to camp servants or, sometimes, very young, unofficial auxiliaries. Your duties would be far from glorious. You'd be responsible for carrying gear, tending to horses, foraging for supplies, or assisting with the laborious tasks of building and dismantling camps. It was grueling work, often performed under harsh conditions, with little recognition and even less comfort. You'd be constantly hungry, constantly tired, and constantly aware of the ever-present threat of disease, accident, or enemy attack. The humor in such a life would be grim, if it existed at all. Perhaps a dark joke shared around a sputtering campfire about the quality of the gruel or the absurdity of a drill sergeant's demands. You might crack a nervous smile at a seasoned veteran complaining about the blisters on his feet. Knowing your own were equally raw, it's a type of gallows humor, a coping mechanism for the relentless grind of existence. Bet you wished you'd paid more attention in sandal-making class. Huh? You might hear someone quip, trying to lighten the mood while simultaneously rubbing their aching feet. The lack of formal child protection in Roman society meant that children were exceptionally vulnerable. If your family was poor, orphaned, or displaced by war, the military could become your de facto guardian, and your role within it could quickly shift from dependent to active participant. You wouldn't have a choice. You would simply be absorbed into the vast, impersonal machinery of the Roman army. The empire's need for manpower often superseded any considerations of age or welfare, a stark reminder of the utilitarian nature of ancient power structures. Think about the psychological impact of this kind of childhood. You wouldn't have the luxury of extended adolescence, of exploring your identity, or of a safe space to make mistakes and learn. Your identity would be forged in the crucible of discipline, survival, and the constant threat of violence. You'd learn to suppress emotions, to harden yourself against suffering, and to prioritize the group over the individual. This wasn't just about physical strength, it was about mental fortitude, about becoming a miniature cog in a much larger, often brutal, machine. The Roman army didn't just train soldiers, it shaped citizens. For boys who entered its orbit early, it became their primary school, their family, and their entire world. You learned about loyalty not from abstract lectures, but from seeing your tent mates share their last scraps of food or stand shoulder to shoulder against an unseen enemy. You learned about courage by watching men face terrifying odds. You learned about leadership by observing centurions barking orders and expecting instant obedience. This was a harsh, unforgiving education, but an effective one for the purposes of the empire. This training wasn't always successful. Of course, not every child who entered this world became a hardened legionary. Some undoubtedly perished from disease, accident, or the harsh conditions of campaign life. Others might have deserted, though the penalties for doing so were severe. Yet, enough survived and adapted to make the presence of these young, unofficial, or very early recruits a significant, if often overlooked, element of the Roman military apparatus. They were the anonymous, silent backbone, the earliest foundations of the legions that conquered and held vast swaths of the ancient world. The image of a Roman child, not playing with toy chariots, but drilling with a wooden sword. His small face set with a seriousness far beyond his years is a powerful and unsettling one. It forces us to confront the darker, more inconvenient truths of an empire we often romanticize. It reminds us that glory often comes at a steep, human cost, borne disproportionately by those least able to defend themselves. As the Roman sun beat down, turning the dusty training grounds into a shimmering haze, young Lucius, now perhaps 10 or 11, found himself not merely observing, but actively participating in the brutal daily routines of what could only be described as a pre-legionary existence. You'd already be familiar with the rhythmic thump of marching feet, the sharp commands of the drill instructors, and the glint of steel. But now, it was your small hands gripping the wooden practice sword, your lungs burning as you ran drills, and your ears ringing with the constant din of a camp that was as much a school as it was a military post. The legions, those seemingly invincible forces of Roman power, had an insatiable need for fresh bodies. While the official minimum age for a legionary was typically 17 or 18, the reality on the ground, especially during prolonged conflicts or times of high attrition, was far more fluid. It wasn't uncommon for boys, some as young as 14, to be formally enrolled, their youthful appearance belying a fierce determination honed by a lifetime of hardship. But even younger than that, boys were integrated into the military system, performing vital roles that, while not always directly combatant, placed them squarely in the heart of the Roman war machine. Imagine yourself as one of these pre-teen recruits, not yet a full legionary, but far from a civilian. You might be designated a tiro, a raw recruit, even if your age meant you were technically underage. Your days would be a relentless cycle of physical exertion and rote learning. You'd be taught how to march in tight formations, not just on flat ground, but over rough terrain, uphill, downhill, sometimes carrying a practice pack that felt heavier than you were. The aim was to build endurance, discipline, and the ability to move as one cohesive unit, essential for the legion's tactical effectiveness. Beyond marching, there was the constant drilling with weapons. You'd learn the proper stance for wielding the gladius, the short, thrusting sword that was the Roman legionary's iconic weapon. The pilum, the heavy javelin, would be thrown repeatedly, its weighted head designed to bend on impact, rendering it useless to the enemy. You'd be taught how to hold and maneuver the scutum, the massive rectangular shield, using it as both defense and a blunt weapon. Every movement was precise, every thrust deliberate, every parry practiced until it became second nature. It wasn't about individual flair. It was about synchronized, deadly efficiency. The sheer physical toll on these young bodies would have been immense. Growth plates are still forming, bones are still strengthening, and yet you'd be putting yourself through the kind of strenuous activity that would challenge a fully grown adult. Injuries would be common sprains, fractures, blisters, and muscle strains. There would be no modern sports medicine, no physical therapy, just a grim expectation to push through the pain. Rub some dirt on it, boy, a grizzled veteran might grunt, the closest thing you'd get to medical advice. An uncommon detail that hints at the younger ages of some recruits comes from the Roman funerary steles. While the age given might be an approximation, some depict individuals in military garb with remarkably youthful features, or even explicitly state ages that, by modern standards, would be considered childhood. Furthermore, some archaeological digs in Roman frontier forts have yielded children's toys and even small, child-sized military equipment, suggesting that not only were children present, but they were actively engaged with the military identity from an early age, possibly as early recruits or dedicated camp followers. The psychological burden was equally heavy. You'd be constantly under scrutiny, your mistakes met with harsh punishments. The Roman military ethos was built on an iron discipline that left little room for error or individuality. You were part of a collective, and your failure could endanger the entire unit. This constant pressure, combined with the omnipresent threat of actual combat, would have aged you far beyond your years. You'd learn to suppress fear, to obey without question, and to accept a reality where your life was perpetually on the line. Historians still debate the extent to which these unofficial or very young recruits engaged in direct combat, but it's clear they were often in harm's way, even if not on the front lines. A camp under siege was a perilous place for everyone within its walls. You might be fetching water under a hail of arrows, or helping to shore up defenses while enemy soldiers pounded at the gates. The reality of war, with its chaos, its brutality, and its sudden, arbitrary violence, would have been an unavoidable part of your daily existence. Think of a young boy, perhaps a milites caligati, a soldier's boy, wearing sandals like the legionaries, scampering between tents, delivering messages. You'd be nimble, quick, and inconspicuous, making you ideal for such tasks. But even a simple message could lead you into dangerous territory, through areas recently raided, or past patrols of hostile tribesmen. The mundane could turn deadly in an instant. You might even find yourself on the very edge of a skirmish, carrying water skins for the fighting men, seeing the grim realities of battle up close. It's hard to imagine the kind of fear and adrenaline that would course through your veins. A child witnessing such carnage. Beyond the physical drills, there was the relentless conditioning of the mind. You'd learn Latin commands. If you didn't speak it natively, and the specific jargon of the legion, you'd be indoctrinated into the Roman pantheon of gods, offering prayers and sacrifices for victory, believing that the divine favor of Jupiter or Mars would protect you. The sense of camaraderie, the bonding that occurs between soldiers, would begin to form. A powerful force that would bind you to your tent mates, your contubernum, in a way that transcended friendship. These men were your surrogate family, your protectors, and your comrades in a world that offered little outside of their shared struggle. This early exposure to the military also served a critical social function. For many poor families, particularly those in the provinces or rural areas, sending a son into the army was one of the few avenues for social mobility. It offered a chance to escape poverty, to gain citizenship if you were an auxiliary non-citizen soldier, and potentially to earn land and a pension upon discharge. For a young boy, this wasn't just about survival. It was about the slim hope of a better life, a chance to rise above the station of your birth. This hope, however distant, was often the carrot that lured young hands to pick up the sword. You might hear a veteran joke about the awful camp food, perhaps something like, "This hardtack is so tough. I swear it could stop a Celtic axe." A moment of shared misery transformed into a fleeting, dark humor, or maybe a quip about the never-ending task of polishing armor. My reflection is so clear now, I can finally see all my bad life choices. Such moments, however rare, would provide a brief respite from the relentless grind. The sheer scale of the Roman Empire's military operations meant that every potential source of manpower was considered. If a boy was strong enough, disciplined enough, and desperate enough, he could find himself wearing the Caligay military sandals and marching alongside men twice his age. These weren't necessarily formal legions of child soldiers, but rather the permeation of youth throughout the military system, a testament to the brutal pragmatism of Roman expansion and defense. As you consider the life of these young boys, you realize that for them, childhood ended abruptly. There was no gentle transition, no extended period of sheltered growth. From an alarmingly young age, they were subjected to a process designed to strip away innocence and forge them into instruments of the state's will. Their play became training, their dreams replaced by the stark realities of survival, and their future, often a short one, inextricably linked to the fortunes of Rome's legions. As the Roman sun continued its relentless march across the sky, baking the very stones of the legionary camps, young Lucius, by now perhaps a small, wiry teenager, found his days defined less by the clang of swords and more by the constant grinding work that kept the vast Roman military machine operational. You see, while the image of a Roman soldier is almost invariably that of a fearsome warrior in the thick of battle, the reality for many, especially the younger, less experienced recruits, was far more mundane, yet no less perilous. The legions weren't just about fighting. They were complex, self-sufficient communities that required an immense amount of support staff. And this is where the surprisingly varied non-combat roles child soldiers filled come into stark, often uncomfortable, focus. You might not be wielding a gladius in the front ranks, but you'd be carrying water skins under a scorching sun, your small frame straining under the weight. Your job might be to gather firewood, a seemingly simple task that could lead you into dangerous, enemy-infested forests. Perhaps you'd be tending to the legion's pack animals, the mules and horses that carried supplies, equipment, and even wounded soldiers. Imagine the sheer responsibility of caring for these crucial beasts. Knowing that their well-being directly impacted the legion's mobility and survival, you'd learn quickly how to groom them, how to feed them, and how to spot the early signs of illness. Skills that were as vital as any combat training. Think about the sheer logistics of feeding tens of thousands of soldiers. You might find yourself working in the camp kitchens, grinding grain for bread, butchering meat, or preparing the soldiers' meager rations. It's a dirty, grueling job, often performed in stifling heat or biting cold. But without it, the army would starve. You'd become adept at handling various tools, understanding the nuances of food preparation, and perhaps even learning a trick or two for making the bland military diet marginally more palatable, perhaps crushing some wild herbs into the gruel. One of the most crucial, yet often overlooked roles was that of a messenger. In an age before instant communication, human runners were the lifeblood of military intelligence and command. You'd be small, agile, and perhaps, due to your youth, less likely to be perceived as a threat by enemy scouts. You'd carry vital dispatches between commanders, relaying orders or intelligence across vast distances, often through dangerous, unmapped territory. Imagine the immense pressure the fate of an entire legion could rest on your ability to deliver a message accurately and quickly, all while navigating treacherous landscapes and avoiding enemy patrols. A simple stumble, a wrong turn, or an encounter with a hostile scout could mean not just your death, but the failure of an entire military operation. This was a non-combat role that carried life-or-death stakes. Historians still debate the degree to which these young individuals were formally recognized as soldiers versus simply camp followers. The lines were exceptionally blurry. Many were colones, literally camp servants, or pueri, boys, terms that encompassed a wide range of duties. They might be orphans adopted by the legion, sons of soldiers accompanying their fathers on campaign, or even young slaves purchased or captured to serve the army. Regardless of their exact designation, their presence was ubiquitous, and their contributions, while often overlooked in official histories, were indispensable. An uncommon detail that highlights their varied roles is the evidence of young boys acting as strigatores. After a grueling march or intense training, legionaries would be caked in sweat and dirt. The strigil, a curved metal tool, was used to scrape off oil and grime from the skin, effectively a Roman shower. Young boys were often tasked with assisting soldiers with this, helping to clean and oil them down. It sounds menial, but it was an intimate interaction, building bonds and familiarity, and keeping the soldiers healthy and ready for duty. It also further integrated these youths into the daily rhythm and personal lives of the fighting men. You might also find yourself maintaining equipment. Every piece of armor, every weapon, every tool needed constant cleaning, repair, and sharpening. Rust was a deadly enemy. Dull blades were useless, and broken equipment could cost lives. You'd learn the meticulous process of polishing lyrica segmentata, sharpening gladii, and mending worn leather straps. It was a repetitive, often tedious job, but one that demanded attention to detail and a nascent understanding of military necessities. Keep that sword sharp, kid, a weary centurion might tell you. It's the only friend you'll have in a tight spot. Then there were the duties associated with sanitation and construction. Roman camps were marvels of temporary engineering, but they required constant upkeep. You'd be digging latrines, collecting refuse, and helping with the construction of temporary fortifications, digging ditches, erecting palisades, and building watchtowers. These were back-breaking tasks, performed with rudimentary tools, often under the watchful eyes of harsh drill masters. You'd learn to move earth, to cut timber, and to work as part of a team. All skills that contributed directly to the safety and functionality of the camp. The sheer exposure to the realities of war, even in these non-combat roles, was profound. You'd see the wounded being brought in, their cries of pain echoing through the camp. You'd witness the grim rituals for the dead. You'd hear the constant rumors of skirmishes, of enemy movements, of upcoming battles. This was not a sheltered existence. It was a front-row seat to the brutality of ancient warfare, shaping your worldview in indelible ways. The constant need for vigilance and obedience would be drilled into you. Whether you were fetching water or mending a saddle, your actions were part of a larger, coordinated effort. Disobedience or negligence could have severe consequences, not just for you, but for the entire unit. This instilled a deep sense of responsibility, often far beyond your emotional maturity. You didn't have the luxury of childish mistakes. The stakes were too high. Despite the hardships, there would be moments of grim humor, small acts of camaraderie that would break through the monotony. Maybe a seasoned legionary, seeing your small frame struggling with a heavy load, would offer a gruff word of encouragement or even a small piece of his own meager rations. You might hear a veteran joke. "My scutum is so old. It fought in the Punic Wars and still complains about its back." Such moments, however fleeting, provided a vital human connection in an otherwise impersonal existence. The use of these young individuals in support roles highlights the pragmatic and utterly unsentimental nature of the Roman military. Every pair of hands, every strong back, every quick pair of legs was an asset to be utilized. Whether officially enlisted or not, these boys were integral to the functioning of the legions, performing essential tasks that freed up adult soldiers for combat duties. Their lives, though often unrecorded in the grand narratives of Roman history, were a testament to the harsh realities of ancient life, where childhood was often a brief, precarious interlude before the onset of arduous labor and potentially the grim demands of war. As the Roman sun continued to beat down on young Lucius, who by now was a hardened youth, perhaps 13 or 14, the emphasis shifted from mere presence in camp to intense, systematic conditioning. You see, the Roman army didn't just stumble into its military dominance, it built it on the back of relentless, often brutal, training. This wasn't just about learning to swing a sword, it was about transforming a civilian, even a very young one, into an unthinking, perfectly coordinated unit of destruction. For those thrust into this life early, this soldier's education was their entire world, defining their bodies, minds, and futures in an unforgiving crucible. Imagine starting your day before dawn, the air still biting cold, with a run of several miles, often carrying a heavy pack. This wasn't a leisurely jog. It was a forced march, designed to push you to your physical limits before the day had even properly begun. You'd learn to move as part of a contubernium, your 8-man tent group, your pace synchronized with theirs, your breathing falling into a shared rhythm. This early morning exertion built the raw endurance necessary for the relentless marches that were the hallmark of Roman campaigns, sometimes covering 20 miles a day or more, even with full marching packs. Next came the drills, the endless, repetitive practice of military maneuvers. You'd spend hours learning the proper posture for standing in a shield wall, how to lock your scutum with your comrades to form an impenetrable barrier. You'd practice the thrusting motion with your gladius, learning to stab, not hack, at your opponent, aiming for vital organs in a tight formation. The pilum, the heavy javelin, would be thrown again and again, perfecting the arc and the force needed to pierce enemy armor. This wasn't just about individual skill, it was about collective precision. Every soldier a cog in a larger, perfectly synchronized machine. An uncommon detail that emphasizes this intense training is the use of wooden training swords and shields that were deliberately made heavier than their real counterparts. Imagine trying to wield a weapon that felt cumbersome and unwieldy, knowing that the actual sword would feel comparatively light and swift. This was a psychological and physical trick, designed to build superior strength and speed. When you finally picked up a real gladius, it would feel like an extension of your arm, light and deadly. You might also train against wooden stakes, practicing your thrusts and cuts against an unmoving target, over and over, until the movements became instinctual. The Roman drill instructors, the optiones and centurions, were masters of their craft, but also famously severe. Discipline was paramount, enforced with an iron fist. Any mistake, any sign of laziness or insubordination, would be met with swift and often brutal punishment. You might be beaten with a vine staff, forced to stand in an uncomfortable position for hours, or given extra grueling tasks. The goal was to instill absolute, unquestioning obedience. Fear, in this context, was a powerful motivator, teaching you that compliance was not just expected, but essential for survival. Historians still debate the specific curriculum for these younger, often unofficial, trainees, but it's clear they were immersed in a highly structured, physically demanding environment. Beyond weapon drills, you'd learn essential military engineering skills. You'd spend hours digging trenches, building ramparts, and constructing temporary camps. Every legionary was expected to be a capable engineer, capable of transforming a raw piece of land into a defensible fortress in a matter of hours. You'd learn to carry and use tools like the delabra, a pickaxe-adze combination, and the pioneerium, a small shovel, becoming proficient in moving earth and shaping fortifications. Think about the conditions. You'd be training outdoors, in all weather, from the scorching heat of summer to the biting cold of winter. Rations would be simple and often monotonous grain, olive oil, salt pork, and hardtack. You'd learn to appreciate every crumb, every drop of water. Disease was a constant threat, and basic hygiene was paramount, enforced by strict rules to prevent outbreaks. You'd learn to bathe, often in rivers, and to keep your meager possessions, and yourself, as clean as possible. The social aspect of this training was equally important. You were constantly surrounded by other recruits, all undergoing the same arduous process. This shared hardship fostered a powerful sense of camaraderie, a bond that transcended individual differences. Your contubernium became your surrogate family. These were the men you would eat with, sleep with, train with, and ultimately fight alongside. You'd learn to rely on them, and they on you, forging a collective identity essential for unit cohesion. You might hear a veteran grumble, "This isn't training, it's torture." At least they could give us better wine with our daily beating, a moment of shared, sarcastic commiseration. This relentless training continued day after day, week after week, month after month. There was no off-season, no extended breaks. The goal was to build not just physical strength and skill, but mental toughness, resilience, and an unwavering loyalty to the legion and to Rome. You'd be taught to suppress your emotions, to harden yourself against pain and fear, and to prioritize the mission above all else. This wasn't just about preparing for battle, it was about transforming your very identity. One small, almost humorous detail that underscores the practicality of Roman military training was the emphasis on swimming. Legionaries were expected to be able to swim across rivers and perform aquatic maneuvers, often with their equipment. Imagine trying to learn to swim while also wearing heavy woolen tunics or even some pieces of light armor. It would have been an incredibly challenging, if essential, skill for river crossings during campaigns. Just imagine a giant, angry fish chasing you. A drill instructor might shout, "That'll get you across." The sheer scope of this soldier's education was comprehensive, covering not just combat skills but survival, engineering, and the strict adherence to military discipline. For children and young teenagers who entered this system, it became the defining experience of their formative years, stripping away the vestiges of childhood and replacing them with the hardened shell of a potential warrior. It was a brutal school, but one that produced the most formidable military force of the ancient world. As the relentless training continued to grind away at young Lucius, now fully immersed in the rigorous life of a nascent Roman soldier, an insidious change began to occur, not just in his body, but deep within his mind. You see, exposure to constant discipline, the omnipresent threat of physical punishment, and the grim realities of military life had a profound psychological impact, especially on those thrust into this world at such a tender age. The innocence that might have characterized a fleeting childhood was systematically stripped away, replaced by a hardened pragmatism and, often, a simmering layer of trauma. Imagine yourself, just barely a teenager, witnessing the brutal flogging of a comrade for a minor infraction, or seeing the aftermath of a skirmish, the wounded, the dying, the dismembered. These weren't abstract concepts from stories. They were vivid, visceral realities that played out before your eyes. The brain, particularly a developing one, struggles to process such horrors. And the coping mechanisms that emerged were often those of emotional numbness, detachment, and a heightened sense of vigilance. You'd learn to suppress fear, to compartmentalize horror, and to adopt a stoic facade, because any display of weakness could be exploited, or worse, punished. The constant pressure to conform, to obey without question, and to subsume your individual identity into the collective of the legion would have been immense. There was no room for personal feelings, for dissent, or for the kind of emotional exploration that defines a healthy adolescence. Your thoughts, your actions, and even your reactions were dictated by the rigid framework of military discipline. This kind of environment, while effective at producing compliant soldiers, often stunted emotional development and fostered a deep-seated distrust of vulnerability. Historians still debate the prevalence of long-term psychological conditions resembling modern PTSD or complex trauma among Roman soldiers. But the anecdotal evidence and the sheer brutality of their existence suggest that mental scars were as common as physical ones. For boys who experienced this from a very young age, the impact would have been even more profound, shaping their entire worldview and their ability to form healthy attachments later in life. You would have learned that the world was a dangerous, unpredictable place, and that survival depended on strength, ruthlessness, and an unshakable adherence to the military code. An uncommon detail that highlights this psychological hardening is the emphasis on contempt for death, contemptus mortis. Roman military training actively sought to instill a disregard for one's own life in the face of duty. This wasn't just bravery. It was a profound desensitization to mortality, taught through constant exposure to danger, the acceptance of casualties, and the glorification of self-sacrifice for Rome, for a child. This indoctrination would be particularly potent, molding their understanding of life and death in a way that is utterly alien to modern sensibilities. You weren't just prepared to die, You were taught that death in service was the ultimate glory. Think about the loss of agency. From the moment you entered the military system, your life was no longer your own. Every decision, from what you ate, to where you slept, to how you spent your days, was dictated by others. This constant lack of control, especially during formative years, can lead to a pervasive sense of helplessness and a difficulty in making independent choices later on. You learn to follow orders, not to think for yourself, a trait that served the army well but could be debilitating in civilian life. The concept of disciplina, a core Roman virtue encompassing training, education, and strict order, was drilled into you from the moment you woke until you collapsed at night. It wasn't just about physical acts, it was about shaping your character, eradicating any softness or indecision. This relentless pressure, combined with the constant threat of violence from both enemies and your own commanders, would have been a crucible for a young mind. You'd learn to be constantly alert, to anticipate threats, and to react instantly, a state of hypervigilance that is a hallmark of trauma. You might hear a dark joke among the older legionaries. A grim coping mechanism. Don't worry about dying in battle, one might quip. It's the only way you'll get a decent night's sleep around here. Or, after a particularly grueling drill, my back hurts so much. I think I'm starting to identify as a centurion's vine staff. Such attempts at humor, however bleak, were a release valve for the immense stress and fear that permeated daily life. The isolation from family and community, particularly for those recruited from afar or orphaned by conflict, further compounded the psychological toll. The Legion became your only family, your only world. While this fostered powerful bonds of camaraderie within your contubernium, it also meant a severance from any other sources of affection, comfort, or stable emotional support. Your relationships were forged in the crucible of shared hardship, often transactional and focused on survival rather than genuine emotional connection. Historians still debate the specific long-term social integration of ex-child soldiers or very young recruits back into civilian life. Did they adapt, or were they forever marked by their early experiences, struggling to find their place outside the rigid structure of the military? It's likely a mix, with some finding new lives and others carrying the invisible scars of their early service, perhaps struggling with anger, detachment, or an inability to form deep personal bonds. The transition from a life defined by discipline and violence to one of civilian normalcy would have been incredibly challenging, if not impossible for many. Consider the cumulative effect of constant exposure to suffering, whether it was the suffering of enemies, comrades, or even your own. You would have become desensitized. The capacity for empathy, for emotional response, might have been dulled as a necessary defense mechanism. To survive in such an environment, you couldn't afford to feel too deeply, to mourn too openly, or to despair too profoundly. This emotional hardening, while ensuring survival in the short term, could leave a lasting void. So, as you slowly drift into slumber, remember that for many young boys in the Roman world, childhood was a brief, fragile illusion. The soldier's education they received didn't just teach them how to fight, it irrevocably shaped their very souls, leaving them with invisible wounds that, unlike physical scars, might never truly heal. It's a sobering reminder that the glory of empires often comes at an immeasurable human cost, paid for by the lost innocence and shattered psyches of its youngest and most vulnerable. As Lucius, now truly a young man in all but years, continued his arduous journey within the Roman military machine, he learned the most crucial lesson of all survival against the odds. In a world where life was cheap and death lurked around every corner, from the battlefield to the unsanitary camp, simply staying alive was a victory in itself. This wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about cunning, adaptability, and making stark choices in circumstances that offered no easy answers. Imagine a skirmish, not a grand battle, but a sudden ambush on a foraging party you're with. Arrows fly from unseen enemies, shouts erupt, and chaos descends. Your training kicks in. You instinctively drop to one knee, raise your scutum, and draw your gladius. But you're small, still developing, and you know a direct confrontation might mean your end. This is where adaptability comes in. Do you bravely stand your ground against overwhelming odds, a decision that might be suicidal? Or do you find cover, assess the situation, and look for an opportunity to escape or to strike from an unexpected angle? For many young soldiers, the latter was often the smarter, albeit less heroic, path to survival. Path to. The battlefield wasn't just about strength, it was about reading the flow of combat, understanding the weaknesses in enemy formations, and knowing when to push and when to retreat. You'd learn to recognize the subtle cues of fatigue in an opponent, the telltale sign of an impending charge, or the vulnerability of a flank. This wasn't taught in a textbook, it was learned through observation, through the grim lessons of watching comrades fall, and through the instinct for self-preservation that honed your senses to a razor's edge. One of the stark choices often faced by these young combatants was the moral one: when to show mercy, and when to be utterly ruthless. Roman warfare was brutal, and captives were often enslaved or executed. For a young boy, perhaps not yet fully desensitized to violence, these moments would have been profoundly disturbing. Do you finish off a wounded enemy, ensuring they pose no further threat? Or do you hesitate, momentarily seeing their humanity, only to risk your own life? The prevailing military culture would push you towards ruthlessness, but the individual conscience, however suppressed, might still struggle. Historians still debate the ethical implications of using childlike figures in warfare during antiquity, often highlighting the pragmatic necessities of manpower versus any consideration of childhood innocence. The records rarely dwell on the emotional toll on these young lives, focusing instead on military outcomes. This silence, in itself, speaks volumes about the societal acceptance of such practices, an uncommon detail that demonstrates the resilience, and sometimes the grim ingenuity, of young soldiers is their ability to improvise. Ancient military life was full of unexpected challenges. If your sandals wore out on a long march, you might learn to fashion crude replacements from leather scraps or even woven plant fibers. If a piece of your equipment broke, you'd learn rudimentary repair techniques from older legionaries. These were not skills taught in formal lessons, but learned through necessity, a testament to the resourcefulness fostered by constant hardship. A good soldier, an old veteran might say, can make a spear out of a stick and a fight out of thin air. Think about foraging, a common task for younger or less experienced soldiers. You'd be sent out from the camp to find food, water, or firewood in potentially hostile territory. This required not just bravery, but keen observation skills, a knowledge of local flora and fauna, and the ability to distinguish safe areas from dangerous ones. You'd learn to move stealthily, to read tracks, and to stay alert for signs of enemy presence. It was a perilous scavenger hunt, where your life, and the sustenance of your unit, depended on your vigilance. The ability to endure pain and hardship was also crucial. You'd suffer from hunger, thirst, exposure, and constant physical discomfort. Injuries, both minor and severe, were a part of daily life, and you'd learn to suppress the pain, to push through it, because showing weakness could endanger yourself and your comrades. The ancient world had no painkillers, no sophisticated medical care on the battlefield. You learned to simply bear it. "My leg hurts so much." You might hear a soldier grumble, "I think it's trying to desert without me," a dark joke acknowledging the constant discomfort. The tight-knit structure of the contubernium also played a vital role in survival. These 8 men were your brothers, your protectors. You relied on each other for everything, for shared rations, for mutual defense, for a watchful eye during sleep. This bond, forged in the crucible of shared danger, was often stronger than family ties. If one of you was wounded, the others would do their best to help. Even at great personal risk, this collective spirit, this absolute reliance on your comrades, was a powerful force that often meant the difference between life and death. So, as the ancient shadows lengthen and you settle deeper into your sleep, Consider the raw courage and sheer tenacity required for these young combatants to survive in a world utterly devoid of the safety nets we take for granted. Their resilience wasn't born of choice, but of grim necessity, forged in the crucible of war, making them true, albeit reluctant, masters of survival. As the Roman moonlight bathed the silent encampments, casting long, stark shadows, Lucius, now fully ingrained in the military rhythm, was living a truth that the grand histories of Rome rarely whispered aloud. You see, beneath the gleaming armor and the triumphant arches lay the empire's dark secret, the systemic, often unacknowledged. Normalization of using young individuals, some barely more than children, in its vast war machine. This wasn't an anomaly. It was an ingrained, pragmatic, and utterly chilling aspect of Roman power, often glossed over in idealized accounts of ancient glory. Imagine a world where the very concept of a distinct, protected childhood, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for the majority. Children were small adults, expected to contribute to the family and the state from a young age. This societal norm provided the fertile ground for the military to absorb young individuals, often without formal age restrictions being strictly enforced, especially during times of pressing need. When the legions required manpower, they simply took it, and age was often a secondary consideration to strength, obedience, and availability. The Roman military, with its incredible organizational capabilities, didn't view children as fundamentally different from adults in terms of their potential utility. A young boy, though physically weaker, could be trained, disciplined, and hardened just like an older recruit. And, arguably, they could be molded more easily, their minds more pliable, their capacity for unquestioning obedience more profound. This wasn't about malice. It was about the brutal pragmatism of an empire constantly at war, constantly expanding, and constantly needing fresh bodies to fill its ranks and support its campaigns. Historians still debate the extent of formal enlistment of minors, but the archaeological and epigraphic evidence, combined with literary references, strongly suggests that boys were present in military contexts from very early ages. Was it formal enlistment at 14, or was it an informal apprenticeship from 7, gradually hardening into de facto military service? The nuances are complex, but the outcome was often the same: a childhood lost to the demands of Mars. An uncommon detail that underscores this normalization is the existence of children's graves found within or near Roman military cemeteries, sometimes marked with epitaphs suggesting a connection to the legion. While some might be simply the children of soldiers who died while accompanying their families, others hint at a more direct involvement, perhaps as pueri militares, military boys who succumbed to disease or accident while serving in a support capacity. These silent stones bear witness to the forgotten lives of those too young to fight, yet too close to war to escape its grasp. Think about the visual landscape of a Roman military camp or a frontier town. You wouldn't just see adult legionaries. You'd see boys, some barely grown, performing duties, wearing rudimentary military attire, or carrying equipment. This was a normal sight, not something shocking or unusual. It was simply part of the fabric of Roman military life, a testament to how deeply ingrained the concept of early integration was. No one batted an eye. It was just how things were done. The Roman concept of patria potestas, the absolute power of the male head of a Roman family over his children and slaves, also played a role. A father could effectively commit his son to service, or sell him, or offer him as a laborer to the military, with little to no legal recourse for the child. This inherent power imbalance meant that many young boys had no say in their fate, their lives determined by the decisions of their elders and the insatiable needs of the state. This normalization wasn't necessarily born out of deliberate cruelty, but out of a pervasive cultural mindset that prioritized the collective good of Rome above individual welfare, especially for those without status or wealth. The glory of the legions, the expansion of the empire, the defense of its borders, these were considered paramount. And if that required the early enlistment or de facto service of its youth, then so be it. You might hear a veteran joke, perhaps grimly, about the sheer number of young faces he'd seen pass through the ranks. These fresh recruits get younger every year, he might sigh. Soon they'll be bringing babes in swaddling clothes to the training grounds. Such dark humor, while a coping mechanism, also reveals an underlying recognition of the youthfulness of some of their comrades. The Roman system was incredibly efficient at turning raw human resources into disciplined military assets. This efficiency, however, came at a profound human cost. The lost childhoods, the psychological scars, the physical toll on developing bodies. These were the unseen casualties of an empire built on the bedrock of military might. They were the silent sacrifices that allowed Rome to project its power across continents. A stark reminder that history's triumphs often have a darker, more uncomfortable underside. As the Roman night deepened, wrapping the ancient world in a shroud of stillness, Lucius, now an experienced, if still young, survivor of the legions, might have occasionally heard whispers, not of battle, but of dissent. These were the rare, often subtle, historical voices that dared to question, or at least hint at, the moral complexities surrounding the exploitation of the young in Rome's military machine. You see, while the normalization of child involvement was widespread, it wasn't universally accepted without a murmur, however faint. Imagine a grizzled old senator, perhaps in the twilight of his career, lamenting in a private letter or a philosophical treatise about the erosion of traditional Roman virtues. While not directly condemning the use of young boys as soldiers, he might express concern over the declining moral character of the youth, subtly linking it to their early exposure to the brutality of war and the loss of a proper civilian upbringing. These weren't overt protests, but rather nostalgic sighs for a bygone era when childhood might have been perceived as a more sacred, protected phase. Or picture a Roman mother, her heart heavy with anxiety, offering desperate prayers to the household gods for the safe return of her young son, who had been swept into the legions. Her quiet anguish, though not recorded in grand historical narratives, represented a countless chorus of unspoken pain. These personal tragedies, multiplied across the vast empire, form an invisible tapestry of suffering that subtly questioned the human cost of military expansion. Their voices were not heard in the forum, but their sorrow was a silent form of dissent against a system that demanded such sacrifices. Historians still grapple with finding explicit condemnations of child soldiery in Roman primary sources, as the concept itself was viewed differently. However, inferences can be drawn from discussions about the ideal age for military service, the welfare of soldiers' children, or the perceived moral decay of society. These often serve as indirect critiques, hinting at an underlying discomfort with the realities of youth in the army without directly challenging the state's authority. An uncommon detail that offers a glimpse into these subtle critiques can be found in the legal codes surrounding the inheritance and emancipation of soldiers. While designed to provide some stability for military families, the very need for such laws implies a recognition of the precariousness of a soldier's life, and by extension, the vulnerability of his children, who might be left orphaned or without support if he fell in battle. The legal system, in trying to mitigate the harsh consequences, indirectly acknowledges the human toll, including on the young. Think about the philosophical writings of some Roman thinkers. While many glorified military service, others, like Seneca, occasionally touched upon the fleeting nature of life and the suffering inherent in human existence. While not directly addressing child soldiers, their broader critiques of war's cruelty or the pursuit of endless conquest could be interpreted as a more general, subtle lament for the human lives, including young lives, consumed by the demands of empire. These were not calls for revolution, but quiet, contemplative questions about the true cost of Roman greatness. You might hear a weary, battle-scarred veteran, far from the ears of his superiors, lamenting the innocence he saw vanish from the faces of the newest, youngest recruits. "They look like my youngest brother," he might mutter to a trusted comrade. "Too young for this life, Too young for these horrors. This personal empathy, however suppressed, was a silent form of protest against the brutal reality. Such sentiments wouldn't find their way into official reports, but they existed, passed in hushed tones around campfires, a testament to the lingering humanity within the ranks. Perhaps a wry, dark joke would follow. A common coping mechanism. At least they're too short to get hit by a javelin aimed for the chest. The concept of a proper coming-of-age toga virilis was deeply symbolic in Roman society, marking the transition from boyhood to manhood, typically in the mid to late teens. For boys who entered military service well before this ritual, that transition was blurred, or entirely skipped. This disruption of traditional social rights was, in itself, a form of societal deviance from the ideal, even if it was tolerated out of necessity. It hinted at a recognition that something fundamentally important was being lost when children were denied the full arc of their youthful development. These whispers of dissent were rarely loud, rarely organized, and certainly never powerful enough to challenge the pervasive military culture of Rome. They were instead like faint echoes in a vast canyon, moments of personal reflection, philosophical musing, or quiet anguish that acknowledged, however implicitly, the profound human cost of Roman power. They remind us that even in the most seemingly monolithic societies, individual consciences could, and often did, grapple with uncomfortable truths. As the final embers of the Roman day fade, and you settle deeper into the quiet of the night, consider the enduring echo of those young lives, thrust so early into the crucible of war. The legacy of the lost, those countless Roman child soldiers and young recruits, isn't etched in grand monuments or celebrated in epic poems. Instead, it's a more subtle, often invisible, presence in the annals of history, a profound undercurrent that shapes our understanding of ancient societies and the true cost of their triumphs. Imagine Lucius. If he survived, now an old man, perhaps a veteran with land granted for his service, he might carry the physical scars of old wounds, but more profoundly, he would bear the invisible wounds of a childhood utterly consumed by the military. His worldview would be irrevocably shaped by discipline, violence, and constant vigilance. He might struggle to adapt to civilian life, finding the mundane rhythms of peace jarring after decades of martial intensity. This is the unseen legacy a generation of individuals whose emotional and psychological development was profoundly altered by their early immersion in war. The very success of the Roman Empire, its vast conquests and enduring stability, was built, in part, on this pragmatic exploitation of its youth. The seamless integration of young individuals into military life meant a constant replenishment of the ranks, a seemingly endless supply of manpower that allowed Rome to sustain its ambitious military endeavors for centuries. This legacy isn't about individual glory, but about the systemic efficiency of a society that prioritized collective power over individual well-being, especially for its most vulnerable members. Historians still debate the precise long-term demographic and social impacts of this early military service on Roman society as a whole. Did it create a more hardened, less empathetic populace? Did it contribute to specific social issues or familial structures? These are complex questions, difficult to answer definitively from the limited sources available, but the implications are vast. An uncommon detail that points to this enduring legacy is the pervasive military culture that permeated Roman society, even in ostensibly civilian life. The discipline, the hierarchy, the emphasis on duty and public service. Many of these values, often romanticized, had their roots in the brutal training and experiences of military life. Experiences that often began in childhood. The very character of Roman society, with its focus on order and conquest, was arguably forged in the fires of military camps where boys learned to become men, or at least, effective soldiers, long before their time. Think about the absence of extensive lamentation for these lost childhoods in Roman literature. This silence, in itself, is a powerful legacy. It signifies a societal acceptance, a normalization so complete that the early integration of youth into the military machine was simply not considered a tragedy to be publicly mourned or extensively commented upon. It was simply the way things were, a necessary component of Roman might. This collective oversight, this historical blank space, is perhaps the most chilling part of their legacy. Yet, in their resilience, their adaptability, and their often unacknowledged contributions, these young individuals left another, more inspiring, legacy. They demonstrated the incredible human capacity for survival and endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. They were the anonymous backbone of the legions, performing essential duties that allowed the mighty Roman war machine to function. Their lives, however brutal, were integral to the grand narrative of Rome, reminding us that history is often built on the quiet struggles of those at the bottom of the societal ladder. As you drift off completely, let the echoes of their unseen lives settle softly around you. The true story of Roman child soldiers is not a tale of heroes, but a quiet, profound testament to the harsh realities of a bygone era. It reminds us that behind every glorious empire, there are countless untold stories of struggle, sacrifice, and the enduring, often invisible human cost of power. Human cost.